I used to work late shifts at a small warehouse outside of town, about 20 minutes from my apartment. The job itself wasn't bad. I mostly handled inventory and signed delivery logs for incoming trucks. The warehouse sat in an industrial area surrounded by empty lots, storage facilities, and abandoned buildings that looked like they'd been forgotten years ago. At night the whole place felt dead. After midnight there were barely any cars on the roads except for truck drivers and the occasional cop passing through. One Friday night in November, I got off work around 1:15 a.m. I remember checking the time because my manager had kept me late helping unload a shipment that arrived behind schedule. It had been raining earlier, and the roads were still wet enough to reflect the streetlights. The air smelled like wet concrete and gasoline. I got into my car and started driving home like normal. About 5 minutes into the drive, I noticed headlights behind me. At first I didn't think anything of it. There weren't many roads connecting the industrial district back into town, so it wasn't strange for another car to be going the same direction. But after a while, I started noticing little things. Every turn I made, the car made too. When I sped up slightly, it sped up too. When I slowed near a yellow light, it slowed with me instead of passing. I looked in the mirror a few times trying to make out the car, but it stayed just far enough back that I couldn't identify the model. All I could really tell was that it was dark-colored, maybe black or dark blue. The headlights were unusually bright though, almost blinding in the mirrors. I remember telling myself not to be paranoid. People drove the same routes all the time. Still, I had this weird feeling in my stomach that kept getting worse. I decided to test it. I made a right turn into a quiet residential neighborhood that definitely wasn't on the way toward downtown. The streets there curved in circles and dead-ended into cul-de-sacs. I figured if the car followed me through there, it would confirm something was off. The headlights turned right behind me immediately. My chest tightened. I drove deeper into the neighborhood, taking random turns without signaling. Left. Right. Another right. Then straight through a stop sign because nobody else was around. The car copied every move exactly. At that point, I started getting nervous enough that my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I'd pulled my phone out at a red light and considered calling somebody, but I didn't even know what I'd say. A car is behind me. It sounded stupid, even in my own head. Then the light turned green. I kept driving, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe whoever it was lived nearby. But the second I pulled onto a long empty street with no houses for almost half a mile, the headlights suddenly sped up closer behind me. That's when panic finally kicked in. I pressed harder on the gas. My car wasn't especially fast, but I pushed it well over the speed limit trying to create distance. The other car stayed right behind me the entire time. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I remember the road clearly because there were no streetlights there. Just darkness, wet pavement, and those headlights filling my mirrors. The car got so close at one point I couldn't even see its front bumper anymore. Just light. I thought about driving to my apartment, but I immediately decided against it. The last thing I wanted was whoever this was knowing where I lived. So instead, I headed toward a 24-hour gas station near the highway where there were usually people around. The moment I turned toward the station, the car backed off slightly. Not enough to disappear, but enough that I noticed it. I pulled into the gas station fast, parking near the front entrance under the bright lights. There were 2 other cars there and a guy pumping gas on the opposite side. I sat there gripping the wheel, staring at the entrance to see if the other car would pull in too. It didn't. The headlights slowed near the entrance, then kept driving past the station without stopping. I remember sitting there for almost a full minute just breathing hard and trying to convince myself it was over. Maybe I really had been overthinking everything. Maybe the driver realized I was nervous and backed off. But something still felt wrong. I looked down at my phone for a second to text my friend about what happened. When I looked back up, The same headlights were sitting across the street in an empty parking lot facing directly toward the gas station. My stomach dropped. The car was just sitting there completely still. I couldn't make out the driver because of the glare, but I could tell the engine was still running. I stayed inside my car, pretending to scroll through my phone while secretly watching it. About 3 minutes passed without movement. Then suddenly, the headlights turned off. The car disappeared into darkness completely. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. I locked my doors even though they were already locked. My eyes stayed glued to that parking lot, waiting for movement. For a door opening. For someone stepping out. But nothing happened. The lot stayed dark and silent. Then someone knocked on my driver's side window. I nearly screamed. The guy standing there wore a gray hoodie with the hood pulled up. I hadn't even seen him approach. He looked maybe mid-30s, pale, thin, with rainwater dripping off his sleeves. He smiled slightly and motioned for me to roll the window down. Just behind him, across the street, I saw the headlights turn back on again. I froze for a second staring at the guy outside my window. Everything in my body was telling me not to unlock the door. He kept smiling though, like he was trying too hard to look harmless. I remember the hood casting a shadow over most of his face, but I could still see his eyes locked directly on me. He knocked again, louder this time. I cracked the window maybe half an inch, just enough to hear him. "You okay?" he asked. His voice sounded calm, almost friendly, but something about it felt rehearsed. Like he already knew the answer. "Yeah," I said quickly. "I'm fine." He glanced over his shoulder toward the dark parking lot across the street where the headlights were still facing us. Then he looked back at me. "That car's been following you." The second he said it, my stomach dropped harder than before. I didn't answer. He leaned slightly closer to the glass. "I noticed it back on Holloway Road. Been sitting over there for 10 minutes now." I looked past him again. The headlights remained perfectly still. "You know them?" he asked. I shook my head. "You shouldn't stay here," he said quietly. That line sent a chill through me because it sounded less like advice and more like a warning. Before I could respond, the gas station door opened behind him and another customer walked outside carrying snacks. The hooded guy immediately stepped back from my window. His entire expression changed the second someone else appeared nearby. He gave me one last look and said, "Just lock your doors." Then he walked away toward the side of the building. I watched him disappear around the corner near the dumpsters. The whole interaction couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds, but it rattled me badly. I kept expecting him to come back or circle around behind my car. After another minute, I decided I was done sitting there. I didn't care if I sounded paranoid anymore. I just wanted to get home safely. I started the engine and pulled out of the gas station slowly. The headlights across the street switched on immediately, and followed. I felt actual panic hit me then. Not nervousness. Real panic. My hands were shaking hard enough that I nearly dropped my phone trying to unlock it. I called my friend Marcus because he lived closer than anybody else. He answered half asleep. "Dude," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I think somebody's following me." There was a pause. "What?" "A car. They'd been behind me for like 20 minutes. Where are you?" I told him the intersection I'd just passed. "Don't go home," he said immediately. "Drive here." Marcus lived in a duplex about 10 minutes away in a busier part of town. I headed there while keeping an eye on the mirror every few seconds. The car stayed behind me the entire drive. At one point another vehicle pulled between us at a red light, but the dark car switched lanes just to stay directly behind me again. That was the moment I knew this wasn't coincidence anymore. I started describing the car to Marcus over the phone while driving. "Dark sedan maybe," I said. "Tinted windows. Bright headlights. Can you see the plate?" "No, call the cops." I thought about it, but part of me still felt ridiculous. I kept imagining trying to explain the situation and being told there wasn't enough evidence to send anybody. Meanwhile, the car behind me kept getting closer every few minutes. I finally reached Marcus's neighborhood around 2 a.m. His street had rows of duplexes packed close together with cars lining both curbs. I figured if the driver saw I wasn't alone, they'd leave. I turned onto Marcus's street. The headlights turned too. "They're still behind me," I said into the phone. "I'm outside," Marcus replied. I saw him standing near the curb in sweatpants and a hoodie under a porch light. The second my car pulled up, the dark sedan slowed about 4 houses back. I parked fast and jumped out while Marcus walked toward me. "Which one?" he asked. I pointed immediately. The sedan stayed there idling under a dead streetlight. The windows were too dark to see inside. Marcus stepped closer to the curb and yelled, "Hey!" The car didn't move. He shouted again, louder this time. "What do you want?" For a few seconds nothing happened. Then the sedan slowly rolled forward. I remember feeling relief at first because I thought it was leaving. Instead, it stopped directly across from Marcus's driveway. The driver's side window rolled halfway down. I couldn't see the person clearly, just the outline of someone sitting inside. Then a man's voice called out from the darkness, "You dropped something back there." Neither of us answered. The voice continued, "Wallet maybe." Marcus looked back at me confused. I checked my pockets automatically even though I already knew I hadn't dropped anything. Then the car door opened and my entire body locked up. The person stepping out wore dark clothes and gloves despite the relatively warm night. He looked tall, broad-shouldered, maybe late 40s. I still couldn't see his face properly because the streetlight above him flickered constantly. He held something in one hand at his side. I remember Marcus muttering, "Get inside." We both started backing toward the duplex slowly. The man took a few steps toward us. "I just want to talk," he said calmly. The object in his hand caught the light for a split second. It looked like a hammer. The second Marcus saw the hammer clearly, he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward his front door. I heard the man's footsteps speed up behind us across the pavement. Not running exactly, but moving fast enough that panic hit instantly. Marcus unlocked the door so quickly he nearly dropped his keys. We stumbled inside and slammed it shut. He threw the deadbolt over just as something hit the other side of the door hard enough to shake the frame. I backed away immediately. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. The pounding came again. 3 heavy bangs. "Open the door," the man outside said calmly. That was the worst part. He didn't sound angry or frantic. His voice stayed weirdly controlled, almost casual, like he genuinely expected us to let him in. Marcus grabbed his phone and finally called 911 while I looked through the blinds beside the window. The man stood on the porch facing the house completely still. Up close I could see he had short gray hair and a narrow face, but his expression looked empty. Not furious. Not emotional at all. He just stared at the door with the hammer hanging loosely at his side. Then he looked directly toward the window where I was standing. I dropped the blinds immediately. "Police are coming," Marcus yelled through the door. The man outside didn't answer. For a few seconds everything went silent. I remember hearing the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and Marcus talking frantically to the dispatcher while we both stared at the entrance waiting for the next hit. But instead, we heard footsteps moving slowly across the porch. Then silence again. I peeked through the blinds carefully. The porch was empty. The sedan still sat across the street though, engine running. "He's still out there," I whispered. Marcus came beside me to look. The driver door of the sedan hung open slightly, but the man was nowhere in sight. That scared me more than if he'd stayed visible. We started checking the windows around the duplex one by one. Marcus's place was small, only 1 floor, with windows facing the backyard and alley behind the building. Every shadow outside suddenly looked wrong. I remember the dispatcher asking Marcus to stay on the line until officers arrived. She said patrol cars were about 7 minutes away. 7 minutes felt impossibly long. Then we heard something scrape against the back of the house. The noise froze both of us instantly. It sounded like metal dragging lightly across brick. Marcus whispered, "Backyard." We moved quietly through the kitchen toward the rear window. The backyard itself was tiny, surrounded by a wooden fence with an alley behind it. The motion light above the back door hadn't turned on yet, so most of the yard sat in darkness. I leaned slightly toward the glass trying to see movement. That's when the motion light clicked on. The man was standing right outside the back gate staring toward the house. He hadn't tried climbing over. He was just standing there motionless with the hammer still hanging at his side. I stumbled backwards so hard I knocked a chair over. Marcus cursed under his breath and locked the back door even though it was already locked. The man took one slow step closer to the gate. Then another. He never broke eye contact with the house. The dispatcher must have heard us panicking because Marcus suddenly started shouting our address again into the phone. Then the man smiled. I'll never forget that smile because it looked completely wrong. Empty. Like somebody pretending to understand what smiling was supposed to look like. He raised one hand slowly and pointed directly toward me through the window. My blood went cold. Then red and blue lights flashed outside the front of the duplex. The man's expression changed instantly. He turned and walked calmly toward the alley without running. Within seconds he disappeared behind the fence. Marcus and I rushed to the front window just as two police cruisers pulled onto the street. The dark sedan was already moving away from the curb. One of the officers tried blocking it with his cruiser, but the sedan accelerated hard down the road instead. Tires screeched loudly through the neighborhood. The cops took off after it immediately. I remember standing there shaking while another officer stayed behind taking our statements. Marcus explained everything while I kept looking outside expecting the man to reappear somehow. About 20 minutes later, one of the officers returned. They'd lost the sedan near the highway. No plate number. No clear ID. The officer asked me again if I'd ever seen the man before or if I had problems with anyone at work. I told him no. I genuinely had no idea who he was or why he picked me. That should have been the end of it. I stayed at Marcus's place the rest of the night, and called off work the next day. By afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing was random. Maybe some mentally unstable guy. Maybe road rage that escalated too far. But around 6 p.m., Marcus knocked on the guest room door holding something in his hand. His face looked pale. "This was under my windshield wiper," he said quietly. It was a folded piece of paper. There was no writing inside except for one sentence printed in uneven block letters. "You shouldn't have stopped driving."